Hello everyone. We're going to look at chapter 20 here, Islamic world powers, Middle Eastern powers, 1400, 1800. We'll start with the Turkish ruling houses, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals. Timur, some of this is sort of context. Timur, who was a Turkish king, this would have been something that would have been covered in the early world history course at the end of it. He united Western Asia in the 14th, 15th centuries. But by the 1450s, his empire was falling apart. And from those ashes, we see multiple new Turkish warlords arise that form pretty much the last three great Muslim empires before by the 19th century, the general fall of anything that we would think of as a Muslim, Turkish, Arabian type empire. The Ottoman Turkish Empire's expansion, 15th century to the 18th century. Conquest under Osman, warlord. They were intended to subdue, not really destroy territories. They had campaigns against the French, against the Germans, against the Prussians, the Austrians. All this is in the Balkan region. Balkan region, for simplicity's sake, is Southeast Asia. Southeast Europe. Pretty much the inter-regional zone, very mountainous, forested zone that really connects Europe to the Middle East. This Balkans region sort of connects Europe into Asia. Everything pretty much south of Russia all the way down to the edge of the Mediterranean. This Balkans region, one of the most war-torn regions in the world in the last 500 years. Much of this Balkan region, though, came under Turkish rule by the 15th century. And manages to stay under Turkish rule, well, for the next, all the way until close to the 1900s, early 1900s. Constantinople. It was called Byzantium. Previous to this, it was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. It was renamed Constantinople centuries before this. It fell 1453, fell to Sultan Mehmet II. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived since the late 400s CE, pretty much 1,000 years earlier, when the Roman Empire fell. And this was the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. The walls of Constantinople held for centuries against invaders. I'm not saying Constantinople was raided a few times, but the walls never fell until gunpowder and cannons came along in the 1400s, and they were able to blow the walls down. 20-foot thick walls, the greatest walls, the greatest city fortress probably in history of the world. And it worked. The Eastern Roman Empire survived for almost 1,000 years, and then Sultan Mehmet, Muslim conqueror, brought the walls down and brought down the 1,000-year reign, which some would consider maybe the actual end of the Roman Empire, which means the Roman Empire would have lasted over 2,000 years. Sultan Suleiman, he increased Ottoman territory to its greatest extent, taking almost all of what had been the ancient Roman Empire in Africa, Asia, Europe. His troops eventually reached the gates of Vienna, Italy, before a treaty was signed. In Eastern Europe, what becomes known as the Ottoman Empire. It faces threat of Ivan the Terrible in Russia, and goes all the way to the edge of Russia, and takes regions of what would be considered modern-day Russia, became under Muslim expansion and Muslim authority. There was multiple times in history when the Muslims were just this close to conquering at least Eastern Europe completely. Multiple times. The Ottomans were not as successful at sea, though. They do take a few islands in the Mediterranean, but they were not really successful warrior navy merchants. They did not have a successful warrior navy. They were successful merchants, but even then, their merchant success was probably more land-based, and if it was ocean-based, it was Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. But coming to the west into the Atlantic and even the greater Pacific, they didn't have much success at all. Suleiman, known as the lawgiver, he drew up an entirely new law system, wide variety of crimes, reformed the bureaucracy in his empire. And it's significant because this does have influences on Western law codes. You should understand that much of Western law, we think of as the West, European, what eventually becomes American law, government, mathematics, science, much of it is borrowed or directly copied from the Muslim empires of the Middle Ages. Far more advanced. Mathematically, science, they had universities, colleges, schools, academies, large cities, well ahead of anything Europe had. Basically, from the fall of the Roman Empire, for the next 600-700 years, really the center of science and learning was in the East, between the Middle East and India and China. And so much of what our society became was built off of or expanded upon from their work that they did while Europe was going through the Dark Ages. Much of the rest of the world was not going through the Dark Ages. Empire of Timur, Ottoman Empire. This is Empire of Timur, this broad empire, including much of what would be like Afghanistan today, much of the Middle East, all the way over into what we think of as like what would be Pakistan today, over into India. It was a huge empire. It was large. And this is also an outgrowth of what was the Mongol Empire. This was part of the Mongol Empire. This was sort of a successor to the Mongol states. You still have some of those out there. The Khanate of Central Asia, that's a Mongol. We've talked about the Mongols a little bit, having to do with the Russians. They were a power on the world stage for over 500 years, all across Asia, into the Middle East and into Europe. And we have the Balkans region over here and all around the Black Sea. And eventually, the Ottoman Empire does go all the way into it and pretty much conquer Southeast Asia, or Southeast Europe. Conquer Southeast Europe for over 200 years, pretty much until the time of World War I. And we can see the greater expansion here of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it's massive. It was an empire to rival the Roman Empire. It was just as big as the Roman Empire, as far as actual territory. That includes water territory, which is included in there too. But half of the empire would have been water territory. Which, I mean, sure, you have to look how you conclude that or not. Admittedly, there was a lot of money, though, to be had through the water because there was all the fishing opportunities, there was all the trade opportunities. So the water itself held very inherent value, even if not the water itself, but all of the things that the water provided, the resources, the trade, the travel, the communication, things like this. There's Balkans region here. Southeast Europe. You can look at this map if you like to. I'm going to take a little time on it. It tells you a lot about the expansion of and how powerful it was. And what's almost amazing is when you consider how much power and how much authority they had in technology and science. They were certainly the rivals of anything Europe had technologically. When they collapsed, it collapsed fast. It fell apart fast. And European powers just flew in to basically take all that territory in the 19th century and early 20th century. The Ottoman Empire's use of slaves. They extensively used slaves for a variety of purposes. Representatives of the Ottoman rulers, they would often go through conquered Christian territories. Remember, much of this is Southeast Europe, which is a lot of Christian territories. And they would force Christian families to sell their young boys into slavery. This process was known as Devshirme, and I may not be pronouncing it right. I apologize. Being forced into basically forced slavery. These Christian boys were often converted to Islam, trained for imperial service. This wasn't the kind of slavery that we might be more familiar with. This was more like indentured servitude. I mean, some of these people could rise to high status. They could have homes. They could have families. They could own their own slaves. They could have status. They could be warrior leaders, warrior chiefs. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of slavery, being brought in and pretty much being indoctrinated into the culture and being made into a Muslim citizen, sort of by force. And you might live a life within the Muslim empire as long as you abided by the rules that an outsider might think you were a free person, might not even realize you were a slave. It was a different kind of slavery. Trained for military service, they were known as janissaries, the ones that were specifically trained to be soldiers. They were army elite soldiers, and they were usually used to fight Europeans. Interestingly enough, so you would have Muslim armies with large groups of white people, white Europeans, basically fighting on the side of Islam, and then you'd have white Europeans fighting on the side of Christianity. Much of the ruling elite in the Muslim Empire was not even actually Muslim born. It wasn't even, they were not born in that society. Many of them were slaves that rose up through the ranks of government society. They were given land, they enjoyed wealth and status, and you frankly could become rich and successful while still technically being a slave. Concubines, women were often used in this form. For civil service, that's like government service, if I didn't explain that. About 10% would be used in government service. High-ranking, political people. It's like all the administrative stuff, all the administrative, when you go to business, to the government, all the civil servants, all the people working in the offices, doing all the actual paperwork, which was high status. Because you got a good job, a clean job, you didn't have to work in the fields, you didn't have to do labor, you didn't have to work in agriculture, had to be educated. It was high status. The reality was many of these slaves were much higher status than your typical Muslim citizen. Women were often taken to be prostitutes. I've talked about in a previous chapter, sexual slavery, taken as concubines, multiple children. Another interesting thing about this is if you were in most of the societies that were familiar with the use of slaves, let me backtrack that, say it differently. In this time period, what we're familiar with slavery, usually like American style slavery, the Americas style, if you are born into slavery, you're a slave. You're born to slaves, you're a slave. It was not that way. The actual laws in the Ottoman Empire required children to be judged independently of their parents, which means children born would be considered free. They would be considered free, not slave, with a few exceptions. If you were a slave having to do with like criminal, like basically it was for crimes and things, it could be a little different. But if you were a typical person who had been brought in as a slave and you had a child, it could be considered a free Muslim citizen. Rights and privileges. Quite interesting. It's a different way of doing it. It wasn't designed, interesting, look like American slavery, like what happens in the Americas. The slave owners and the slaves are separate. They're two classes, completely separate. It was not that way. The Muslim society actually used slavery to grow their society. They wanted to assimilate and indoctrinate slaves into their society to become new Muslims, to become newly part of their society, to basically grow and expand their influence. It wasn't about conquering and keeping a permanent low slave class society. You could work your way up and increase status, and it was really about growing the greater society. It was not, it just was a totally different way of how they did it. Different idea behind it. How does this image portray women? You should look at that and think about that. You have women here in the middle. They're enjoying their garden, they're in leisure activity, they're listening to music, maybe a romantic story of some sort. They're drinking, enjoying themselves, they've got wine, pleasures, and there was rules on the society, but, you know, whoever painted this, what do you think they thought? Think about what they thought was valuable. Like, what is this in this that they show as value? Women, art, culture, music, you have alcohol, you have women being kept separate, contemplation, interesting stuff. Early Islam often expanded through military conquests, but once they actually took over a region, the idea was for it to become peaceful, learning. It wasn't ruled like a warlord, or ruled like a war regime. The people who were now part of the society were expected to assimilate and accept and simply become part of it. It was actually common in many parts of the Middle East for regions of Ottoman Empire, once they conquered an area, that there would actually be Christians move in and have towns and cities and communities and neighborhoods. They were actually quite religiously tolerant. The only real aggressiveness came in conquest, which they were aggressive military conquerors. But once that was over, they actually enjoyed quite a lot of peace and prosperity, intellectual pursuit, scientific pursuit, cultural pursuit. A great deal of culture, art, architecture, literature comes out of it. It's interesting. All right, let's look at the Safavids. The Safavid Empire had three main components. It had the loyalty of the Turkish Sufis. A Sufi we might simply translate as a mystic of some sort. And the loyalty of these Sufi mystics were known as and I know I don't say this properly, the Kizilbash. They were awarded land in return for giving military support to the Shah. The Shah is the leader, the sort of like I guess we say king, lord. Second, it was based on already established government system in these Muslim lands. Remember, these territories, much of this territory had been ruled by Muslims for, by this point in time, 1,000 years. So none of this was new. The religion isn't new, the authority isn't new. Even though other peoples had come and gone, Indian populations, Christian populations, we see other religious faiths come and go all through the Middle East. It has been primarily Muslim now for close to a millennia, since the 6th, 7th century. So none of this was really new. They weren't having to rewrite the book. They simply came in and continued. Much of it, to be truthful, was simply meet the new boss, same as the old boss. To quote a line from a song, it's just the same general society, just with new leadership, new shahs, new government. But the actual day-to-day cultural life was very similar. Finally, the Shia faith. And it's significant because there's really two significant branches of Islam, the Shia and the Sunni. The Shia faith became dominant in the Safavid. This is where Ishmael was thought to be the descendant of Muhammad, and this became the core of the Safavid rule. Not going to get into any real history about it, but when Muhammad died, there was a division of faith. Some people followed Muhammad's daughter, which her name disappears from me at the moment. Some followed the daughter, and some chose to follow the military leadership of Ishmael. So you end up, almost from the beginning, almost as soon as Muhammad passed in, I guess that was the 6th century, or early 7th century when he passed. Early 7th century, I think. We see a split in Islam, almost from the beginning. one believing his daughter was the proper heir, and one believing the general Ishmael was the proper heir. So, anyway, the Shia faith became the core of the Safavid Empire. Shah Abbas the Great adopted the Ottoman military tactic of forming armies of slaves, as it was becoming the standard. Again, it's better to have the slaves go off and die, right, than your own people. Under his rule, the Safavids reached their most powerful: trade, commerce. Remember, this is all still under Safavid. Arts improving. They fought constantly for control against the Ottomans. So this is another Muslim empire that was fighting for control with another Muslim empire. These are all three Muslim empires that are fighting for control of these regions. And these are large regions. These are not the generally much smaller, limited Middle East that we think of as today. These regions go all the way into India, into Northern Africa, all the way up into Central Asia, all the way into Eastern Europe. Much, much greater territory. Several times greater territory than what we think of today as, quote-unquote, the Middle East, which I use the term all the time because everyone does, but there's not really an actual geopolitical definition of the Middle East. But even politicians use it all the time, but it's really sort of an arbitrary distinction of the Middle East. But anyway, I use it. It's just a common way to say it. Everyone is generally familiar with what you're talking about when you say that. Economic, cultural prosperity, really growing the power of the empire. The Safavid Empire, see Safavid here in the purple, Ottoman Empire over here. This is much of what we think of as modern day. A lot of this is modern. Again, Baghdad here, Iraq, Afghanistan. So it also should be noted the climate has changed a lot in, again, the Middle East in the last 1,000 years. 2,000 years ago, this region of the world was much wetter, much cooler. Wetter, a lot more water, a lot more fresh water, lakes, things like that. It's become much drier in the last 200 years than it was previously. Today, most of this is desert. And while there was a lot of desert back then too, it was a lot more green than there is today. And that's weather, climate, but it's also probably use. That's also probably human use over the years, over the decades and centuries, where a lot of these areas have basically had their resources used up. Because, frankly, from the beginning, the resources were limited. It wasn't a heavily resource-rich area. You get away from this region here, Tigris-Euphrates, of course, the whole Garden of Eden, the whole Mesopotamia region, thousands of years ago was probably some of the most prosperous land in the world, but it's really been used up because this was one of the earliest civilizations. People have been building cities here in this region of the world for, 5,000 years. So it's just gotten used up. Next, we will look at the Mughal Empire in India. Mughal Empire in India came along a little bit later. Huge empire, probably the wealthiest, and probably the largest if you look at just land area. Again, if you look at it includes land and water, it is the Ottoman, because it includes much of the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and whatnot. But if you look at just pure land, square miles of land, this has got the most land. It encompasses most of India, into the Middle East, India, all the way into Southeast Asia. Babur, he claimed ancestry from Timur, whether or not it's true or not. He claimed he was descended from Timur. He was an adventuring general, pushed south. He defeated the Sultan of Delhi. He captured Delhi, which is in generally north-central India. He decided to stay in India. He forms the Delhi Sultanate. This Delhi Sultanate Sultanate, it's just a name for a governmental body. It's an empire known as the Sultanate. Akbar, grandson of Babur, he expanded the Mughal Empire deeper into India. In central India, there's mountains. There's quite a bit of mountains in central India, which is interesting because what it does is it makes India, until modern times, till we have modern technology and transportation, it made India pretty much into two different regions. Many people in northern India and southern India had no interactions for literally centuries, where there was almost no interaction because the central India was covered in jungles, forests, mountains, ravines. It was very, very treacherous territory to get across. And so for most of India's history, it was really northern India and southern India were really two entirely different regions, different peoples, and there was not a lot of connection between the two. And that's significant here because he expands into central India, but has a real hard time actually expanding into southern India. I don't believe he ever actually conquers southern India. Don't get me wrong, it's huge. Maps are very deceptive. Modern maps are incredibly deceptive. They have a Eurocentric view. Pretty much any world map you see is Eurocentric. Puts Europe right in the middle. Of course, who are the ones that design these maps were the Europeans, making Europe sort of the center of the world. And they also show Europe to be much bigger than it actually is. India itself, first of all, it's known as a subcontinent, right? India itself is bigger than Europe. But if you look at most maps, it doesn't give that appearance. You have one today, which is one country, is actually bigger than Europe, which is over 30 countries in land mass. And it would have been similar to that back then. India is huge. It's massive. It's much bigger than most maps give it the impression of. Everything, most modern maps are Eurocentric, and what's really kind of odd to me is that they haven't been adjusted. You can look them up online. You can look up what a real world map looks like. I don't know exactly what you type into Google. We should try that out and look at and see what the world actually looks like based upon actual square mileage. It's pretty surprising. It's much different. It's a much different map. Let's see what else we have going on here. He creates an Indian centralized bureaucracy in northern and central India. This centralized, complicated, lots of departments, bureaucracies, very populous empire. Descendants of Akbar extended the Mughal Empire even further, trying to get into southern India. Southern India, though, was not very happy about that. Because it was so far away, thousands of miles away from basically the centralized government in northern India. We see uprisings, protests, we see riots, revolutions. We have influence of Muslim, Hindus, Buddhists, although Buddhism's been almost eradicated by this time period. There is still Buddhism, especially in eastern India. You can still see Buddhism. Persians, Middle Easterners coming in. Arab influences. Again, it's basically a continent. It's huge, really, much bigger than you might think. And so, yeah, it was centralized for a short period of time. And even then, it didn't really include southern India. It has never actually, until modern times, never has all of what we think of as India ever been under one ruler. Ever. Never has happened. Which it really speaks to very few places in the world. There's very few places in the world that we could say have not at one point or another time, like a region, has not at one point in time been entirely under the rule of somebody. Never. India as an entirety, it was never ever under the rule of any one person ever. So they got close. Much of central India, we see 1525 up here, and then 1539 adding the Delhi region, forming the Delhi Sultanate. We add the blue areas. By 1707 we add these yellow areas, but it needs to be clear these yellow areas were never really under strong control, never fully under their control. And southern India and it's not Madagascar, is it? Maybe it's Madagascar. Not positive. This large island here. This entire southern tip here, which is probably a good 300-400 miles at least, maybe more closer to 1,000 miles, and then the island, and then all these islands. None of this was ever conquered under the control, and again, very short period of time. Very short period of time, these regions fell apart almost immediately. But it still was a huge area, a really, really large area, and this is the size of Europe. So think about that. Look at this, and if you want to put it in context with Europe, like this little area right here would be France. Like this area right here would be Germany. England would be like this little bitty corner right here. Yeah, like just this bottom corner right here would be like the size of Spain. The map really, it's really deceptive how huge it actually is, how huge the subcontinent of India is. All right, let's look at arts. Cultural flowering. Culturally speaking, probably by the 14th, 15th century, there's probably no place in the world that matches this, culturally. Arts, education, literature, sculpture, mathematics, that's not culture, but technologically, culturally speaking, by the 15th century, there's probably no place in the world. Even if you want to look at the Renaissance in Europe, yeah, Italy. Italy, central, northern Italy was, sure, one of the most cultural places on the globe. But that's really a small region compared to we have these massive cultural influences all across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Asia, India, Northern Africa. There's really nothing that matches it. Arabic, Persian, Turkish languages. We see vibrant culture developing, variety of languages. Constantinople, supposedly, I've read that Constantinople, by the 14th, 15th century, there were typically 20 languages being spoken simultaneously, that most merchants, most wealthy merchants hired entire groups of translators because it was common in the merchant stalls for people to speaking 20 regular languages you could hear all the time. It was an incredibly multicultural, multi-ethnic empire. These empires were. Let's see, Turkish immigrants brought weaving, woolen carpets, women and children employed by thousands producing rugs, Persian rugs. This type of Persian rug and weaving is still highly prized. Still highly prized. I was in a store, wow, just a year or two ago, and they had a Persian rug hanging up. It was beautiful. And, you hope it was legitimate. You hope it was authentic. They claimed it was. It was $16,000. Like, oh my God. Like, I could never afford something like that, nor would I want to buy a rug for $16,000. My God, I can go buy a nice brand new car for that. Nonetheless, yeah, these things were highly prized and highly valuable. Even to the point that I remember reading some women would spend their entire lives just making a couple rugs. Their entire life just making a handful of rugs. Yeah, these were works of art. I'm sure there were more common ones made, much more quicker, more common ones made, sold cheaper, but it was highly prized by Europeans, highly prized by Chinese, other people, highly prized by Americans too in later years. Became a national industry, highly profitable. Paintings were really common, miniature paintings, book illustrations. They were the master artist of miniature book illustrations, these little books, like these little handbooks, these small things that were like little prayer books. And they would have the writing in it so small, and these little artworks, paintings, and they would actually use magnifying glasses to paint. And they were incredible works of art. And I remember reading about one of those years ago that sold at some auction for millions of dollars. Really beautiful artwork. I'm sure you can see in museums or look them up online, things like that. One of the largest libraries in this time was actually assembled by the Mughal leader Akbar. He had a library with over 24,000 volumes of books. That was the rival of anything that was in London or Paris. Pretty impressive stuff. City and palace building, public buildings, schools and mosques were built in all the empires. Universities, we see all kinds of systems that benefited the public, hospitals, bathhouses, parks, museums, libraries, architecture combined traditional Muslim architecture with Hindu architecture traditions. We see massive palaces, greater than anything that was being built in Europe in this time period. We don't see anything in Europe matching the size of what they were building in India until the 1900s, under the Mughal Empire in India. The type of palaces they were building, the type of structures they were building. We don't see anything matching it in Europe till centuries later. Massive architecture, structures. There were individual palace structures that were entirely, I'm trying to think what's the right word to use. I've totally blanked on the word. I don't have it in my notes. But they were entirely contained. Maybe that's the way to put it. People were born, lived their entire lives, and died in these palaces. Not slaves, regular citizens. These palaces were so huge they were the size of cities. Some of them, they could house over 10,000 people that lived in there 24/7, 365. They had schools, they had playgrounds, they had mosques, they had offices and parks and fountains and baths and homes, all inside these palaces in central India, northern central India. With the slaves, the concubines, the military, all in one place. Entirely contained places that were massive structures. Pretty crazy stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of it was built by slaves. A lot of it was built by laborers. It was. But so was stuff being much, again, yes, slaves weren't building much stuff in actually Europe itself. Slaves weren't really building things. There was very few slaves in Europe. But in northern Africa, the Middle East, and of course in the Americas, much of the Americas was built by slaves. So Europeans weren't against using slaves to build things. They just didn't really do it in Europe. I'm going to come back to that because I want to show this. Peacock Throne here, which is an image of, this doesn't exist anymore. Peacock Throne was, as I'll talk about in a moment, it was actually torn apart and destroyed. We have a Taj Mahal in northern India. Still, I don't know if it's officially one of the wonders of the world. It probably is, but it should be. It probably is. I haven't looked that up in a long time, but it's really amazing. So, I know, now I'm over here. I keep moving around. A fine example of the power and wealth, Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan, again, King Jahan. He commissioned the construction of an elaborate throne known as the Peacock Throne. Was commissioned for his, I guess it was for him. I don't know why for a moment I thought it was for his wife, but no, maybe it was for him. Anyway, was covered with emeralds, diamonds, other precious jewels. Today, the throne would be equivalent to close to $10 million just for the basic purchase of just for the absolute construction of the gold and the gems. $10 million throne. Yeah. Eventually, when the empire does collapse, the throne is taken away as plunder. You know, when you conquer someone, you take away their stuff, you take away their treasure. Plunder is what it's called. It was taken away as plunder and disassembled and torn apart, obviously. It was covered in gold and gems and rubies and diamonds and emeralds. Yeah. This is a reconstruction, an image of what it might have looked like. An artist drew this. And quite beautiful. Of course, incredible waste of resources and time and money and funds. With that aside, the fact that they had such resources and capability to build these massive palaces and structures and all these schools and libraries and all these bathhouses and all these mosques and hospitals and universities and palaces and the Peacock Throne, just the fact that they had the ability to do all that and still manage to have a military and expand and grow their empire, that shows the massive amount of wealth and power they had. Equally, certainly equal to anything Europe had, and probably more powerful than anything Europe had at the time. Taj Mahal, this was the wife. This is the one. Taj Mahal is a memorial to Shah Jahan's wife. Superb mix of Islamic and Indian architectural design. Took 20 years to build that, and over 20,000 workers worked on it. You know, that's the kind of thing you read about when you hear about the pyramids, you know, in Egypt from thousands of years before this. You know, tens of thousands of workers, took decades to build them. Egyptian emperors would start building their pyramids, which was, you know, their tombs, when they became emperor or when they became pharaoh. Even though they might live for 20 years, they basically started building it as soon as they were pharaoh, in planning on whenever they died, they'd have it built already for them. And if they lived long, they would continue building and continue growing and putting more and more time and effort into it. You know, Taj Mahal, quite interesting kind of stuff. A lot of it certainly was a waste, but it doesn't change that there was a massive amount of power and wealth there, and of course, the cultural influences of it and architectural influences still are with us today. Intellectual advances, religious trends, a variety of advances occurred during these empires, for these three empires in this period. The geographer and cartographer. Geographer is, of course, someone who studies geography and land. Cartographer is a map maker. So geographer and cartographer Piri Reis produced maps that included, at the time, and this is an image here of one of his maps, at the time it included all of the known land formations in the world. Included everything that they knew about, which makes it unique because it combined more Turkish, Middle Eastern, Indian maps with European maps. Remember, there's world trade going everywhere, so nothing's happening in a vacuum by this time period. If there's a technology that's discovered in Europe, it will eventually make its way into the Muslim empires. Vice versa, if there's a technology discovered in Delhi, it will eventually make its way to Paris. It might take decades, who knows, but eventually it will get there. Everything was eventually shared. There were trade routes that connected Europe and Asia and Africa and Southeast Asia and the Americas. It might take time, but when something was someplace, it would eventually spread everywhere. Eventually everybody would get a taste of it, introduced into it. So we see this stuff spread. These books of maps were used for centuries by sailors all the way into like the 19th, 20th century. These maps were used. And who knows how really accurate they were. But at least it gives you the general idea, hey, if I sail east, I'm going to eventually run into something. I'm just going to sail out into the empty ocean. A couple particular people here. Abiy Ahmet Chalebi founded the first Ottoman medical school. He trained physicians of the empire. He conducted medical research. Science and medicine was easily centuries ahead of anything going on in Europe. They were doing science, medicine, they were doing surgeries, they were doing organ replacements. I don't know how successful they were, but they were doing surgeries and organ replacements already in the Middle East in this time period, in these empires by the 16th, 17th century. Europeans were still basically putting slugs on people to suck out their blood. Hey, you know, you're sick, let's stick is it a slug? Is that what it's called? No, leeches. Sorry, leeches. They were still putting leeches on people to suck out their blood and the idea of the leech, in case you're unaware, was to suck out the bad blood. Yay! Stick a bunch of leeches on me because I got a cough. Great. Anyway, so, you know, you got to see this kind of stuff. The medicine and science and technology were centuries ahead of anything Europe was doing in this time period. Let's see. Medical schools, physicians, research. All three empires were unique in that their rule and military might was primarily Muslim, but not exclusively. About 80-20. Much of their empire was actually ruled by non-Muslims. That's 20%. That's again, when you consider this, these three empires together comprised most of Asia, except for the very northern and eastern part, and Middle East, Northern Africa, Eastern Europe. Millions and millions and millions of square miles of land, and 20% of it, on average, was ruled by non-Muslims. Was any of that going on in Europe? Were there any non-Christians ruling anything in Europe? No. No, non-Christian in Europe, you basically were getting yourself killed. Muslims were considered enemies. You would be executed for being a Muslim traveling through Central Europe if you were caught or discovered. You were enemies. So it's interesting, and it actually gave them power, because they brought in a lot of peoples who were not traditionally Muslim. Yeah, some of them were brought in as slaves, but as we already discussed, slaves could actually elevate themselves to being higher than many typical free citizens. They had the ability to bring new ideas, different ideas, were multicultural, multi-ethnic. And there's even regions in India, much of India actually, where Muslims were the minority. Because India was still primarily Hindu, even though it was ruled by a Muslim empire. The actual population was mostly Indian, mostly Hindu Indian. So you have the rulership primarily Muslim, but they brought in thousands of Hindu and Indian peoples to actually help rule in the different regions. Again, India, so huge. So it actually made their empire more powerful, because they did not, once they took over a territory, they changed and almost became inclusive. We're in charge now, but we're going to let everyone be part of it, because it makes our empire stronger, it makes the diversity, made it stronger. At least that was a general belief by many. It's interesting. It depended on the region. The more away from the middle, the more towards you got towards the central, Baghdad, the central region, you were almost exclusively Muslim. But the further on the periphery you got, you would have a lot of other peoples. We have a new religious order which develops in this time period known as the Sikhs. They trace themselves back to a religious leader who believed that God did not distinguish between Muslims and Hindus. So this was sort of a prophet that attempted to find commonalities between Muslims and Hindus, to try to find peace and commonality between them. And it becomes very popular because for centuries, Western India was a mixture of Muslim and Hindu, many of them living side by side in the same communities. And so the idea of a religious faith that sort of brought the two together and allowed them to coexist peacefully was very appealing to many people. Certainly there's hardliners on both sides. Hindus have nothing to do with it. Muslims have nothing to do with it. But eventually the Sikh population numbers in the hundreds of thousands in Western India, and today they are they're a world faith. They're still very small. Sikhs are a small population as far as the world religious faith, compared to like Christians or Hindus, for instance, but and Islam, of course. But still, they become significant, and they have a foothold, and they become solid, and they manage to hold on as sort of a middle ground between the two faiths. And then over time, they develop into a entirely unique religious faith that doesn't really reflect either one. It's entirely unique and different. But we do see, if you actually study Sikhism and look at it, you can see there are certainly elements there of Islam, elements of Hinduism, and then other things that don't really match either one. But it was a syncretic religion developed during this time period, and then becoming more successful and its own really truly independent faith in later years. Non-Muslims under Muslim rule. All right, so you lived in a Muslim empire. The Muslim empire in central Middle East was mostly Islam, but as you got to the periphery, you see places that are 50-50, and you get to central India, and it's like 10 Islam and 90% Hindu. So you have a wide variety. And of course, in Eastern Europe, you have a wide variety too. There's a lot of Christians under Muslim rule, and when you get to Eastern Europe, the Balkans region. So this was a very diverse empire religiously, and it was generally religiously tolerant. Much more so tolerant than Christians were of any other faith. Now, once these empires were established, the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Mughal, once they were firmly established, All three empires had general policies of religious tolerance to where anyone of any faith could worship. Anyone of any faith could worship within the Muslim empires. All three of them. Now, there was different times. You occasionally do have hardline, very radical shahs that might take over, or a sheikh that might take over. Don't confuse that with Sikhs. That might take over, and you might see in a few places where they're very particular and they really want it just to be Islam. But as a general rule, for most of this period of the 15th to the 18th century, most of these empires, once they were established, had total openness to other religious faiths living there and operating there and being citizens and even being part of the government. With rules. There were rules. You had to obey all Muslim laws. So even if your faith was contradictory to Muslim laws, you still had to obey the laws of Islam. Further, you typically had to pay taxes. You had to pay what was sometimes referred to as a head tax. Basically, it was a tax for being non-Muslim. It was a small tax. It was small, and most people paid it without a problem. It would be probably not much different than us thinking about paying property taxes or income taxes today. We all do it. You simply accept it as part of life. If you get to live in peace and quiet and be able to worship your own faith, it was well worth it for most people to do this. You had to obey the laws, the customs, and pay the taxes. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of Muslims conquered large regions in Eastern Europe and India. The Mughal conquest in India brought Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and we mentioned Jains or Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism is a faith which still exists today. Jains is still a faith which is really an extreme faith. Not that, let me correct that. They're not extreme as far as not terrorist or anything, nothing like that. Just the following Jainism is it's really challenging to follow Jainist faith. Look it up; it's really interesting. But no, they're the exact opposite of that. They're total and complete pacifists. They literally won't hurt a fly. It's quite interesting. But the reason I'm even spending any time on this because I wasn't even positive years ago that Jainism was even something still around, because this is an ancient faith. Not far from where I live, I actually was driving and saw a Jain temple. Just a couple years ago, and I was like, wow, a big temple. I was really surprised by that. I had not really, because it's a difficult faith to follow, at least anciently. Maybe it's more moderate today than the way it used to be, but it would have been really tough to follow. If you're curious about it, look it up. It's quite interesting. Zoroastrianism, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, all in the same empire, all in this Muslim-controlled empire. In the Balkans, we have Christians. Oh, I didn't mention Jews. You've got Jews living in the Middle East and Jews living in Eastern Europe. They allowed all of them to live under Ottoman rule. This was the Ottoman region. Eastern Europe was Ottoman Empire. They allowed Christians and Jews to live as long as they paid their taxes, didn't cause any problems, followed the rules. It's interesting. We have evidence that there were thousands, probably tens of thousands, of Christians that actually migrated from Eastern Europe, where they were serfs, as we've talked about in previous chapters, which is basically slaves. And they migrated freely into the Turkish regions of the Ottoman Empire, like modern-day Turkey, specifically because they would no longer be slaves. Again, you only became a slave if you were conquered by the Muslims. If you chose to freely move into their empire, you were a free citizen, as long as you obeyed the rules. We think tens of thousands of Christians migrated out of Eastern Europe, peasants that were lived basically as serfs under slaves, to live as free citizens in the Ottoman Empire, which had more technology, better science, better education, better medicine, cleaner cities, running water. They just had to agree to pay the tax and obey the rules. And their life was actually probably much higher quality and probably greater longevity. They simply choosing to live under Ottoman rule. Quite interesting stuff. Got that included in there. The head tax, the jizya, the head tax. Now, there was another purpose of the jizya. It really was a twofold purpose. One, to generate revenue for the empire. You got all these foreigners coming in. all the foreigners who lived there were going to pay the tax. So they're going to generate revenue for the empire. Quite a bit amount. But another thing was, it was actually a way to get you to convert without being forced. It's sort of I don't know if it's sort of coercive. Hey, you're going to have to keep paying the tax unless you convert over. And if you convert over to Islam, then we may be able to forego the tax. So it might have been a way to sort of softly push conversion without beating people over the head with it. You could continue to worship your faith, Jewish, Christian, whatever, it's fine, but you got to pay the tax. But if you want to convert to Islam, then we may be able to give you an exception and get you out of the tax, which is interesting. Now, in India, the Mughal Emperor Akbar even went so far as to end the tax, because of these three regions we looked at here, the Safavid, the Mughal, and the Ottoman, the one that was probably under most constant conflict, the one that was probably under the most constant inner turmoil, literally civil war turmoil and revolution, was the Mughal. Because the Mughal was the one of the three empires that primarily ruled over a non-Muslim population. Most of the Mughal Empire, the population were Hindu, and many of them simply did not agree with it. And so the whole time of the Mughal rulership, it was never really all that peaceful. There was constant revolts and revolutions and riots, and there was a lot more continual military presence necessary to sort of maintain peace in the empire, put that in quotes. And so what Akbar actually did was eliminate the head tax on Hindus, hoping it would make it more peaceful and make less uprising, more peaceful interactions. That was the idea behind it. And it probably worked, at least for some. Probably did some. But we do see the other extreme, as I alluded to like 20 minutes ago. I said some were not accepting. A handful of leaders of these empires over the years were not accepting of non-Islams. For instance, Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb, he banned traditions in Indian culture. He didn't agree with many different traditions, like sati, for instance, which was where widows actually committed suicide when their husbands died. That was something that was actually still practiced into the 20th century. I'm pretty sure it's outlawed now, but that was still practiced into the 20th century to not be a burden on the family when your husband died, and on his funeral pyre. A pyre is when they light him on fire and they burn the body. The widows were expected to throw themselves onto the pyre and burn themselves to death alive on top of their dead husband. As a way to not be dishonorable or a burden onto their family. And that was something that was still done 100 years ago. I'm sure it's not legal, or I'm sure it's outlawed now, I would hope. Castration was a common thing. They used to castrate boys to make them slaves, eunuchs. It's a castrated male as a eunuch. The idea of the eunuch males was they would use them as slaves, therefore they couldn't impregnate the concubines, because India had... no one knows exactly, but it was probably thought India had hundreds of thousands of concubines, which is basically female slave prostitutes that were like second, third, fourth, fifth, 12th wives kind of thing. And they wanted to make sure that only wife one actually could reproduce and have the official heirs of, the royalty or the family line. And so what they would do is the only one who would be able to have sex with wife number one would be, of course, be the husband. Well, no one else was supposed to have sex with the concubines. But all the male slaves would be castrated so they could not impregnate any other women, things like that. So it was a common kind of thing. So he wanted to get rid of that. That was not done in the Muslim Empire. That was an Indian thing. Lots of anti-Hindu measures, requiring to pay taxes on goods. And he even Aurangzeb even added back the head tax, the jizya head tax. So yeah, not very popular. There was a lot of problems, a lot of issues. Never really... Of the three empires we're discussing, the Mughal Empire was never, ever what we think of as stable. The other two were pretty stable. The Ottoman Empire was stable for a few centuries, and the Safavid was relatively stable for a while, but the Mughal was never really a stable empire. What do we have down here? Yeah, this is a little information about the Zoroastrianism here, which is it's worships a fire god, and it still exists. Zoroastrian is still a thing, and a lot of historians think it was heavily influential in the actual creation of the Islam itself. Islam is sort of a syncretic religion itself. It has elements of Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, has elements of a lot of different religious faiths, all mixed in, which makes sense considering it comes from right here, Mecca. That's where really the start of Islam really comes from right here, which was influenced by Christianity, Jews, multiple different types of religious faiths all across the Arabian Peninsula. I've seen a historian write a story when I was in college where he could pinpoint elements of a dozen different religions that were all sort of part of this. But then all religious faiths are like that. Christianity's like that. They all basically every religious faith sort of builds upon the previous ideas and previous religious ideas and faiths and traditions of usually previous. Yeah, it's pretty typical. So we have the Ottoman Empire here, which was most of what was the Roman Empire. Roman Empire extended up into here, but this was there. We had the Safavid here, and this. And again, look at the difference here. India is actually the size of Europe, but Europe here looks, on this map at least, to be much bigger. This map distorts it, so this map isn't really great. But it does give a little bit better accurate picture. Africa is way bigger. Way, way, way bigger than Europe. But most maps, Africa is only marginally bigger than Europe. But Africa is something like 8 times the size of Europe. Yeah, much, much bigger. But it gives you an idea of where this stuff is going. And you have, and this is also interesting here, the other Islamic lands. I understand Islam covered this entire region. These were the great empires, but all of northern Africa, most of eastern Africa was Islamic. And some would say, like today, for instance, if I was to ask you, where do the majority of Muslims live in the world? Most people would say the Middle East. Just because that's where you hear about it all the time. You know, here in America, we're very insulated over here. We're really oblivious to much of what happens in the world, truthfully. No, most Muslims today live in Southeast Asia. That's where the majority of Muslims in the world live today, is Southeast Asia. The vast majority. Much more populous, much larger. Population density in the Middle East is really low for obvious reasons. And Southeast Asia population density is the highest, outside of cities, it's the highest population density as a region in the world. Outside of highly urbanized areas. All right. Political decline. By the late 1700s, all the Islamic empires were in decline financially, militarily. All of them were. Safavid Empire, when we think of it like Persia, they didn't have the financial ability to maintain military forces, military weakness, financial weakness. The biggest problem with the Safavids were they were surrounded by more powerful empires. You had the Mughals on one side, you had the Ottomans on the other. They were in a region that was generally low resource ability, lots of desert, lots of mountains, and further they had the Russians to the north, northwest, and the Chinese to the east. They were under constant outside pressures. That was a big problem. Their decline in military strength, basically, when you're surrounded by enemies, and they were literally surrounded 360 by enemies. Other Muslim empires wanted their land, and of course the other peoples. Eventually they just, people just discovered their weakness and they started invading. Afghans basically declared independence. They killed the royalty. Persia was never ever reunited. That was basically the end of the Central Persian Empire. It was gone pretty much by the late 1700s. Afghans rose up, overthrew. Ottoman Empire lasted longer. It suffered from poor leadership. Often happened, and I say often because it happened multiple times, that there was a king who died, an emperor who died, and he had multiple sons. This happened 2 or 3 different times. And the sons, instead of trying to keep a united empire, one time it was 2, another time it was 3, they basically fought amongst themselves, causing internal strife, division, civil war, each one believing they should be the true leader of the empire. Happened multiple times. That's not uncommon in world history for things like that to happen, of course. Of course, the father dies, the ruler dies, the kids fight over it, the empire, there's fighting, there's killing, sometimes there's interior war, civil war, the most powerful son wins, killing off the others. Other times a weaker son wins, who, because his military strength, manages to conquer, but he's a weak ruler. He's, he had a better army maybe, but his rulership is bad, and he's a bad ruler. And these aren't small little areas. These are huge regions that today would encompass multiple countries. Think how difficult it is to rule a country. Imagine ruling 8 countries simultaneously. These huge regions. So, yeah, if you're a weak leader and you're trying to rule territory of that size, no, it's just, you're just bound for disaster. It just isn't going to work. Vulnerable to attack. Most of the lands were surrendered. They did technically survive all the way into World War I, all the way until the early 20th century, when the Mughal Empire officially sort of collapses. But even by the mid-1800s, it was pretty much just, I don't know if I may have just said Mughal, I apologize. We're still talking about the Ottoman, if I said that. We're still talking about the Ottoman Empire. Even by the 1800s, mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire is really just modern-day Turkey. That's why they're usually referred to as Turks. So the Ottoman Empire, they're usually referred to as Turks, which is the region of what becomes modern-day Turkey. Even by the 1800s, there was pretty much just that region around Turkey. They managed to hold on, continued officially, call themselves the Ottomans until around 1914, give or take. 1911, 1912, somewhere in the 19-teens, they're right around the beginning of World War I, right before it, and then it all just comes apart. The Mughal Empire, India, the Mughal provincial governors began to rule their territories. This is where we have basically the regional governors begin to rule their territories. There's the centralized authority that the Mughals had, lasted a very short period of time in the 1600s. It didn't last very long. The majority of India was still Hindu. We see constant Hindu uprisings. We see invasions from outside regions. Actually, eastern border, where there's lots of Hindus outside of actually Mughal territory. We see Hindu warlords and kings actually trying to come in and take over what they believe should be a Hindu-ruled region. I'm sure it wasn't because they wanted the power, the wealth, and the status. But nonetheless, they believed it was a proper Hindu-ruled region, so it shouldn't be ruled by Muslims. And this barely centralized state, which was always in a constant state of controversy is the wrong word, constant state of disruption, maybe the best way to put it, eventually comes apart by the mid-1700s. And, most Muslims by early 1800s are just in the western region, the northwest region of India, as they've been basically pushed out of all of India, that literally on pain of death. And eventually we get a whole other country formed on the western side of India. That's for later chapters. That is it, I think. Yeah, so Hindu resistance, decentralization. Gives you some ideas, gives you some stuff to talk about for that region, some things to think about for class, for the exam, quizzes, and discussion. So thanks for going through it with me, and we'll see you next time.